This video will teach you everything you need to know to get started with grease pencil animation in Blender. Let's get right into it.
TipTut.
Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut. In today's tutorial we'll be taking this Hollow Knight sketch and turning it into a layered 3D grease pencil animation in Blender. This is part 2 in a 2-part series, so if you haven't watched part 1 yet you can do so at the link in the description or in the top right corner here. Otherwise, let's just jump right into it. Okay then, and there you have it. So as you can see, I've now got all of my layers drawn with at least the basics of my backgrounds done. I may come back and tweak these later on. If we look through our camera, again with numpad 0, and select our camera, we can move it along the y-axis to start to see how this is going to come together. All of our layers respective to their camera depth moving in animation. But it's a little bit boring at the moment because nothing is moving. We're going to come back and use some modifiers to add some subtle animation to these smaller plants. But what I definitely need to animate sort of frame by frame traditionally will be both of our characters here, the Knight and Hornet. I want to add some animation to these plants, and I want to add some animation to this little critter guy here as well, just a little touch. So we're going to do a similar thing that we did with the backgrounds. I'm going to animate the Knight in real time, and then I'll fast forward through the rest. With that in mind, let's take a look at animating the Knight. I'm going to hide all of my collections here, and I'm just going to turn on the Knight. Let's go to the 2D animation workspace. So that's looking pretty good. And we'll zoom right in because we don't really need to see anything else. So I'm going to take the empty for my Knight, and I'm just going to turn the opacity of that down. And inside my grease pencil object, in draw mode, we're going to start creating the sketch for our character. Now everything we've done so far has taken place on frame 1. Obviously with animation, we want to start animating and drawing different pictures on different frames. Now, thankfully grease pencil makes this very simple. I'm just going to grab my pencil, but this time because we're sketching, I'm just going to go to my pencil instead. And that just gives me a little bit of pressure sensitivity to work with. So we mentioned previously that we were working with materials, and there was something called color attributes, and that's what we're going to be working with on our sketches. So I'm just going to take this black 5 brush, and I'll just call it pencil. And you can see that when I draw, I just get this kind of black sketchy line. If I switch to color attribute drawing, which you can do in this tab up here, or you can go to your active tool and workspace settings here, and you can adjust from these settings too. You can see that we have this drop down, and we have a selection of colors, and then this mix factor option down here. So you can see here that if I select this yellow color with mix factor set all the way to 1, it's going to start drawing in the yellow that we selected. If I drag this mix factor down to say 0.5, it's going to start blending the original material and our color attribute on top. So to make that really clear, if I go down to say 0.49, it's going to be black with a little bit of yellow on top. So you can see this is quite powerful for quickly changing your colors without creating new materials. However, this does mean that these aren't linked to materials any longer. So you can change the underlying material, but you can't change these things on top very easily. Additionally, you can do things like affecting the randomness of the stroke. So if I go to random here and turn on stroke and say, change the hue randomly, each time I draw, the hue will have changed color on our stroke. Now this only works for strokes, not fills, which is quite annoying because I really wanted it to work for fills for this project. But as you can see, you can get some really crazy effects. So we're going to turn those off for now. We're just going to turn off randomize. We're going to drag our mix factor all the way up to 1. And I like to use this for my sketching. So for example, I'm going to have a red color here. Let's just tab into edit mode and delete everything I've just made. Tab back into draw mode. So for example, now I can use a red color for the core shape of my Knight. I can use, say, green when it comes to animating his cloak. I can use yellow for when it comes to animating his head. And I can use, say, blue for when it comes to animating his nail. So what this does is, sketching wise, it's very simple to work with. And then of course we can just turn off this mix factor when it comes to doing our line work with our pen later on. With that in mind, we need to make a few layers. Let's start with the base animation of our Knight. Okay, so I'm going to make this, let's just choose a nice red color and turn the mix factor all the way up. And we'll rename this layer to base sketch. The Knight here is made up of a few core components. He has this kind of central body circle. He has a larger circle for the bottom of his body. And then he has 2 feet that just connect. Technically, he would have hips as well, but that might be overkill, yeah? Now, he doesn't need arms in this one because we don't really see his arms because they're inside his cloak, so we're not going to bother giving them to him. I'm also going to put the head on the same layer here because I'm basically going to be treating each one of these sketch layers as a animation layer. You know, each one will be animated individually. So that looks pretty nice. Then on a second layer, we're going to need to animate his cloak separately. So we'll put that on a layer here, and we'll make sure we call all of these sketch afterwards and turn off use lights. Let's make his cloak this bright blue color. And although his skull is in front of it, we are of course going to draw it in anyway. And because these are the sketches, we're just getting the basic shape down, and then we'll be drawing the details on top. Then finally, we'll need a final layer for his nail. And we'll make the nail green. Let's start animating our character. I'm going to move to frame 3 because we like to animate on 2s, which means a new drawing every 2 frames as opposed to a new drawing every 1 frame. If you don't know what animating on 2s and 1s means, I'll link in the description and now above me to my 12 Principles of Animation series, which you can watch. It's really useful for just like this core concept stuff. This is more about animating in Blender specifically as opposed to animation. So we want him to look up at Hornet. So it's probably going to be quite useful if we turn on the Hornet sketch layer as well. Now you'll notice that even though we move to frame 3 and start drawing, there is no automatic keyframe. Now you can turn that on, but I find it makes it quite messy. So instead I'm just going to come down here and on my base sketch, I'm just going to hit insert keyframe on all channels, and that's going to remove everything. Now you'll see here that I have this kind of green halo. Now this is the onion skin and shows what was on my previous frame. Why green is the default, I've no idea, because green to me should be the next frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to my onion skin settings and twirl down custom colors, and I'm going to change before to red and after to green. So if I now start drawing a new pose, you can see that now it's created a new keyframe, and if we flip between, we can start to see our differences. I'm actually going to make my before frame pink because I've got red as a base layer. Let's do this as if his head has fully turned towards Hornet. So his head's going to be a little bit thinner. His eye is going to be a bit more visible, and we'll turn it upwards a bit as well. His horn now is obviously going to move further over to the right, but also this curve is going to be less pronounced because it's like a tube, right? So if the tube is like this and it was a curved shape, as you turn to look at that same tube as it rotates, it would look like this from one angle, even though it's a curved tube, yeah? So we're going to take this exact same thing, and to make our lives a little bit easier, let's just erase this. What we can do is we can draw this horn and trace it, then tab into sculpt mode, and we can just push our horn so it's slightly less bent. And because this is only the sketch, we're not too bothered about it being pretty. Tab into edit mode, and you want to change your selection box. The box is quite difficult to select what you actually need, so I like to press W until I get this loop selection, and then I can just draw around what I need, and then pressing G allows me to move it into place. Tab back into draw mode, and we can get rid of any extra variables that we don't want. This horn, same deal, but we'll just redraw it. Let's have this one move a bit further so it doesn't cover his eye. So that's looking quite nice. Good enough for a sketch at least. Now his body's going to remain pretty much in the same place. Maybe he'd shift his weight on his feet slightly, but seeing as it's going to be covered mostly by the cloak. But we do need to draw it because we don't know what the cloak is going to be doing yet, where it's going to be in its flap cycle. So we now have our two extremes. We have where he's looking and where he ends up looking. Quite simple, yeah? So let's take frame 3, and for me to look from one direction to another doesn't take long. So let's say it takes him 8 frames to do it. Let's pop that on frame 9. Halfway between that on frame 5, we'll press I, insert a new keyframe on all channels, and we can start drawing our tweens. So you can see now we have pink and green for before and after. And it's just a case of direct in between for this one. So we have frame 1, the breakdown, and frame 2. So it's just turning his head. Real simple. It's going to be quite quick though. If we press space, that's going to be a very quick head turn. So I think we need to half that again. So I'm going to select all my frames with the timeline playhead on frame 1, and I'm just going to press S to scale up these frames until the final frame is on frame 18. If you scale when the playhead is in a different position, it scales from the playhead. So it's quite difficult to manage. So just make sure you're on the first keyframe and you can scale. Alternatively, of course, you can grab those keyframes and just press G to move them. Now that looks like a more natural speed to me of a head turn. I think what I want is a couple of easings in here as well. So I'm just going to add in a frame here on frame 3, which eases out very gently. So we'll just draw that frame right next to the first. what this does is gives us enough of a guide that we don't need to draw all of our frames on the sketch. We can just draw the important ones. The body probably doesn't even need a guide on here, but we will need one for the eye. So essentially our movement cycle we've got here, if you think of this as frame 1 and you think of this as frame 17, is we've got something like this: 1, 3, 15, 5, 13, 7, 11, 9. So we're going to have this motion where there's not a lot of movement between frames 1 and 3 and not a lot of movement between frames 15 and 17, and then equidistant movement between the rest of the frames. Okay, we're going to have another keyframe here in our sketch layer where we ease the head into its final position. So you can look at these frames and see that we've got a nice head turn. In fact, I think I might like to just even these up. So I'll pop that in the middle. So we've got more even motion. That looks pretty nice. So we obviously only want the knight to turn his head once. As he turns his head, however, the nail will also move. So we're going to go up to our nail layer. We're going to lock the others. We're going to select our green brush. See, I've already forgotten what color green I used. So this is why I don't like using color attributes too much. Obviously, you could make your own custom palette. You can add or remove colors from this palette as well. I don't use it enough for me to bother though. So I'm just going to select this green and go to the final position of the nail. Now, as you can see here, we've only got one keyframe showing in our onion skin, whereas now we've got a whole bunch of keyframes. So you can just start dragging these up to say 10. So we can now see our previous frames in the onion skin up to 10 keyframes before and after. I'm actually just going to hide our sketch now because it's more distracting than it is helpful. And we'll draw the final position for this nail. Essentially, the best thing to do, I find, for simple stuff like this, again, we'll just quickly trace. And we've locked all the other layers, which means when we go into edit mode and do a selection, we'll only select this layer. And I'm just going to scale it down on the X and perhaps a little bit on the Z. And we'll just move it over and rotate it a touch. Okay, so we have here now our Hollow Knight turning his head, and we have the nail turning as well. So what we need now is our cloak animated, and we're going to do something here called the wave principle with our cloak. So I'm actually just going to lock every layer, but we're just going to delete these other ones, okay? And we're going to grab the blue that we've used for the cloak, but I'm actually just going to erase this initial cloak layer. And we'll turn back on the sketch for now. Now we're going to use something called the wave principle to make this cloak look good, which is this idea that waves have peaks and troughs. If you move the wave's peak and trough position across the screen incrementally, then you'll get a nice smooth wave. So this peak would end up here, and this trough would end up here. But of course, then you'd need to continue to draw until you get this kind of DNA effect as the wave moves across the screen. If you'd like a detailed explanation of what the wave principle is, I have made a tutorial on that. You can watch that at the link above, but we're going to give you a brief explanation of it now anyway. So let's say that this is the top of our cloak, and we'd like to have, say, let's do a 5-frame loop. So by the time it reaches the end of this frame here, we're going to need the direct reverse of our loop. So let's insert a keyframe on the selected channel, and let's create the reverse of this loop. So this previous peak has now become this peak, and this trough is now somewhere over here but doesn't exist, so we've introduced a new one at the opposite. Let's go halfway between that, and we'll insert a keyframe on selected layers. Now this peak has moved to here on the next keyframe, so we want it to be directly in the middle where the 2 points overlap here. So the new peak will be at this point, which means the new trough will be exactly halfway here. That's going to start to creep back upwards. So if we look at that, we're already starting to get a little bit of the flapping cloak that we want. Halfway in between that, we'll insert another keyframe on the selected channel. And what I'm going to do, just temporarily, is go to my layers palette, and I'm going to turn off onion skin for my nail and my base sketch here, so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. And I'm also going to go down to my onion skinning settings, change this back down to say just one keyframe before and after, so that we can only see these. So now it's just a case of merging these two things together. So you can just come straight through and flatten out your peaks and your troughs a little bit, so you can start to see how that works, which is the way I prefer to do it. Or alternatively, you can take the previous loop here, trace it, and in edit mode, you can just move it along a little bit so that your peaks and troughs are working correctly, and then just draw in the additional bits that you need. Sometimes it's useful to do that if you're getting used to the wave principle and you're not quite sure how it's going to work. And as you can see, you get a very similar result. So finally then, let's insert on the select channel here, go back to our pen tool. And again, you can do the little cheat if you'd like, or you can just eyeball it. I find eyeballing it gets a more natural wave anyway. So now we have half of our perfect loop. We have the wave starting its peak at the beginning, and now we have the wave ending its peak. So that's looking pretty good. So all we need to do now is duplicate these frames and repeat that same process. So we now have the start of the loop and the same start of the loop. This now has become the middle of the loop because it's the direct reverse. So we'll insert a new keyframe halfway between there. This has become the new peak. So we'll take our previous loop here, go to edit mode, select everything, move it down, add in the extra elements, remove the excess, and we'll start to see that we're putting together our perfect wave. Okay, that's looking pretty good. We now just need a similar thing for the bottom of the cape. However, at the moment you can see that it stops and we want it to loop forever, even though our night animation doesn't. We don't want that to loop forever. So what I'm going to do is going to make sure I've got my cloak sketch layer selected, and over in the properties, modifier properties panel, we're going to add a new modifier called time offset. And we're going to check custom range. And we want the custom range to be from frame 1 all the way up to frame 33. Now this will include 2 copies of the first frame, so we'll need to trim that. But once you've done that, you'll see that our grease pencil object starts to loop. You see we have a problem because everything is looping, not just the cape. It's a very simple fix. You just need to go down to your influence tab here and make sure that the only layer that you're influencing is the cloak sketch. And that will then just loop the cloak and nothing else. Meaning, of course, we can move these keyframes of when the knight turns his head to wherever we want later on. Once again, let's just turn off these layers so that we're just left with the cloak. And we now have our perfectly looping cloak, and I can already see that at the beginning it's kind of snapping quite violently into that first change here. So I think I'm going to tweak this original position a little bit to be something less violent. There, that's looking much nicer. So relatively happy with that. We just now need to repeat the process for the bottom of the cape, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently because this cape we want to follow the contour of the body here as if it's pushed up against his body, and then it's going to start flapping like halfway down. Okay. So whilst we will have a little bit of motion in this top cape section, it's not going to be all of it. In fact, I'm going to create a new layer and call it Cloak Sketch 2, so that we can work with this on our own layer. Let's turn off use lights for that. We'll leave the color as blue, and we'll just do something like, so about here is going to be the start of our wave, and about here is the end of our wave. So you do want it to go at the same speed, so I'm going to go and add a new keyframe in here at the last frame, and we're going to have it be pretty much the same thing, just in the same way that our top of our cloak is, and then it's going to be the same process. To make our lives a little bit easier before we do too much more, I'm just going to go to our modifier properties on this time offset here, and I'm going to duplicate it with Shift D, and I'm going to change the layer of that one to Cloak Sketch 2. So now we have a loop on both of those. Okay. So that's looking pretty good. And that's largely all that we need for our sketches. I think what I'm going to do is actually slow this way down. So I'm going to take our nail and our base sketch keyframes and I'm just going to scale them up. I feel like it makes him look a bit more in awe of Hornet. And I'm going to move them over after the first loop. So you've got this nice static one. And then the character changes his position. So I'm going to grab these keyframes as well. I'm just going to duplicate them so they're the same over here. That looks nice. So we can consider this the base of our knight animation done, and we're now just making things look good. So what I'm going to do is add a second slot, and in that material slot we're going to choose black solid. That's the same thing we used for the critter's legs earlier, and making sure I will add a new layer. I'll add a new layer called body, and I'll do it all in caps so that at a glance I can see that it's my final layer. Just unturn use lights for now, although we may turn them on later on. And we can just start working on drawing our characters. You can see here that I accidentally created that layer at frame 98, which is going to be an issue. So I need to just move that keyframe all the way back to frame 1. And I'm going to lock every layer except for the body so that I can start working on it easily. And this one's going to be nice and easy. We're going to make sure we're back on our fine liner pen tool with the same pixel radius as before. And we're going to make sure that we have close gaps turned on, draw behind turned off. And we're just going to very neatly draw Hollow Knight's body. I think his little legs there are slightly too round, so I might just point them off a little bit more. Bam. Now his body doesn't really move too much at all, so there's really no point redrawing it each frame, but it is going to look very strange if it's the only thing that's static. So we're going to take our body layer, we're going to go to our modifier properties, we're going to add another modifier, and we're going to add a noise modifier to this. And as you can see, that's going to make everything go crazy. If I adjust this position, you'll see this is essentially adding like a scatter value, a noise value to the position of our layer. And as we press play, it's going to change that each frame. Now that's crazy amount. We don't want that much. So let's change that down to like 0.01. And you'll see we get a little bit of this scattering, probably not quite enough. Let's do 0.02. Perfect, that looks good, but it's affecting every layer. Again, we just go down to our influence, we choose layer and we choose body. And now we don't need to redraw every frame, just to have a little bit of motion in our character's body here. And even when they're standing still now, it's going to affect that. Now I'm going to want to do the same thing to the nail and the skull layer, because obviously when they stop moving, they're going to be very static, but there's no need to apply it to the cloak layer because it's always moving because of the loop. So the body was very easy. Let's do the nail layer. So we need to add another layer on top, and to this layer, I'm going to add the nail. And I'm going to put the skull on a different layer to the body as well, even though on the sketch it was the same. So we're going to add a new material slot for the grease pencil object, and I think critter will work nicely for the nail. Yes, that looks good to me. On frame 1, we will just draw in the core shape. Obviously, we're going to want some more details on this. So we're going to switch our tool to the pencil tool, and we're going to draw in some details. Now, you see what happened there? Where I tried to draw this detail, it cut the top of my nail off. That's because I've accidentally left this auto merge turned on. So if we turn that off, we'll be able to add in some details onto the nail without it auto merging. I want this thickness to be the same, but I then want some details on the nail that are smaller. So I'm going to bring that down to a radius of 4. And I'm just going to draw in some cracks along the nail. Something like that. Remembering, of course, to add a slight curve to it because it is a round object. Like that. Lovely. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I want to add a bit of detail and shadow to this nail. So I'm going to go to my material properties and add in a new material slot. And for that, we'll choose shadow. Then we'll add in a new layer. We'll call it nail detail. Pop it down to 0.25 and change it to multiply blending mode. And we'll mask out the nail layer so that it only appears where the nail appears. Now they've got light coming in directly from behind them. So if there were to be true shadows, it would probably be something like this, which seems about right to me. But I'd also like darker material in some of the grooves on this nail. So I'm going to go back down to my nail layer. I'm going to add a new slot for critter, and we're going to duplicate that critter material, and we'll call it nail fill. And I'm going to remove the stroke and just darken up this fill and add a little bit of blue to it. So what I'm going to do is just on my nail layer with nail fill material, I'm just going to start drawing some of these shadows in. Now, if I was clever, I would have done this before I added all these stroke details, but I'm not clever. We only want a few anyway, sort of inside these rings. Maybe a larger one here. Great. So we now have the nail detail and the nail body. We're going to lock every other layer except this one. Okay, so we have here our nail, but with the basic animation that we have this doing, basically just rotating and translating slightly, there's no point drawing this over and over again each frame. So what we're going to do is a little bit of a trick. We're going to select both these keyframes here and just Shift D, duplicate them over to frame 33. Then we'll do the same thing, Shift D, duplicate them over to frame 65. And on frame 65, we'll just grab both of those and tab into edit mode and press A to select everything, and then we'll just rotate it slightly and translate it slightly as well. That looks pretty good to me. So then we're going to select our nail layer, go somewhere between the two keyframes of both of them selected, and go to our interpolation tool up here. We'll make sure we have multi-frame turned on and only selective turned on, and then choose grease pencil, interpolate sequence. For this to work smoothly, let's just remove these keyframes at the start so there's nothing for the computer to get confused about. And we'll just select both those keyframes and make sure that we're somewhere in the middle of them as well. Then we can make sure we're on our interpolation tool. We have multi-frame up here selected and also only selected checked so that it only edits the selections that we have made. Then we go to grease pencil and interpolate sequence. We'll change the amount of steps to 2, so that'll be a keyframe every other frame, so that we're working on 2s here. And I'm just going to go down to my type where it says linear, and I'm going to interpolate that as custom so that I can put in my custom easing path here, like so that when I play back my animation, we've got a nice, smooth, interpolated nail movement. Now that looks pretty good, so I'm going to confirm that. And then we just need to duplicate that keyframe back to the start so that the nail is visible the entire time. Let's just repeat that process for our nail details. So we'll select that, we'll go to somewhere halfway between, grease pencil, interpolate sequence. Luckily it keeps the same path, which is quite useful, and bam, we now have the shadow applied to it as well. So that's pretty good. Let's go back to draw mode and take a look at what we've got so far. Of course, I'll duplicate that first keyframe as well, so the shadow is there. Looking good. And if we want to see the preview of our noise, we can go to object mode 2 and we can see the preview of our noise on our body. That looks great. Okay, awesome. I'm going to do the same thing with the skull then. I'm going to add a new layer on top. We'll call this head, and I'll tab into draw mode. On frame 1, I'm going to add a new material slot, which we will fill with the critter material, duplicate it, and then we'll change this to skull material. And instead of it being blue, I'm just going to change the hue around a little bit to be more yellowy and pull down the saturation. Something like that looks nice to me. And I'll make sure to turn the radius of my brush back up to 8 because we are now doing the edge of this skull. Perfect. Temporarily, let's turn off visibility for the body and the nail. In my original sketch, you can see that the skull came on top of the cloak, so we're going to be doing that. So let's see what Blender can handle by doing all of the skull in one go. So let's make sure that we have got auto merge turned on, and we'll draw the original skull shape. And I'm just going to pop into sculpt mode and pull that into position in a bit. Of course, I've locked every other layer here. And in edit mode as well, let's zoom in. And you see this point, I'm just going to move that point just to neaten up that little lump there that we don't want. That's looking good. So back in draw mode then, we'll do his horns. Nice. This one needs to be behind the skull, so we'll turn on draw behind. And of course, if we just temporarily hide, you'll see that we need the eye here on our sketch. So I'm going to grab my sketch layer, base sketch, and I'm just going to move it all the way to the top. And let's grab black solid and make sure we're on our head layer, and let's draw in the eye. Oops, making sure to turn off auto merge and draw behind this time. Bam, lovely. Let's pop the base head layer back down below. So that looks pretty nice. And we're just going to duplicate that frame and we're going to redraw the next frame. Let's insert a keyframe on this selected channel. And we'll redraw the skull here. I'm going to take a bit more care at maintaining the shape this time. That looks nice. Let's take the base sketch on top. Okay, so that's the skull. And remember to turn on, draw behind for this one. Just trying to neaten it up as well as I go. Lovely. Turn off, draw behind. Let's go to black solid and give him his eye. Lovely. Back in the layers palette then, let's just pop base sketch back down to the bottom again. Lovely. So now we have our two keyframes here and here, remaining pretty similar. So let's see how well it can do the interpolation. Again, I'll just delete this extra one. So making sure that you're in edit mode, let's select both of these keyframes and make sure I have the active layer and then grease pencil interpolate sequence. Yeah, so it's done okay. In fact, it's got most of it right, except for the skull. So the skull might be a bit much. But that's okay, we can fix that quite easily. Let's undo that interpolate sequence. And I'm just going to select one point in this skull with my select tool, turn off multi-frame editing, and then we'll just press Ctrl and Numpad Plus to select everything else in this attached section and delete it. Then we can do the same thing on this last frame here. Delete it. And let's try just interpolating the horns and the eye. Grease pencil, interpolate sequence. Now that worked near perfectly. So I'm going to confirm that. Let's go back into draw mode. That looks real nice. So with that working, we are just going to rename this layer head details, and we'll insert a new layer between that just called head, on which we'll draw only the skull, and then we'll do the same thing. What this does mean, however, of course, is that the skull is going to be behind both horns, but we can fix that, no problem. So we'll draw in the skull, making sure we have auto merge turned on. Okay, looks pretty good to me. Let's do new keyframe on the final frame here. And then we'll select both of these, turn on multi-frame editing in edit mode, select your interpolation tool, turn on multi-frame, grease pencil, interpolate sequence. It's going to maintain the same easing from before. That looks nice. So now you can see that we have our head turn working quite well. If we look at that in draw mode, it'll be a bit easier to see. Boop. But we need to pop this horn behind the rest of the body. So we're going to tab into edit mode, first of all, and add a new layer. And we'll just call this one head underscore behind. Then turning on multi-frame editing and locking everything except the head details layer. We'll select this frame range. We'll select all of these points in that frame range and we'll press M, move to head behind. What that means is when we then lock this layer away again and go back, we can see here that our horn is now below the head. If we turn off use lights for that layer as well, it'll be easier to see that the horn is now behind the head on that layer. And that saved us a lot of time and a lot of drawing. So let's just grab these keyframes here, duplicate them over to the first frame so that we've got something at the beginning. And it's time to draw the cloak and then our character will be done. So in front of the body, but behind the nail, we need to draw a cloak layer, turn off use lights. And this one's going to be nice and simple because we have our loop already made for us. So let's turn off everything except the cloak because we're pretty happy with it. So we have some keyframes for our cloak. It's looking pretty good. And all we need to do is just follow the structure of our guidelines. So I'm going to grab a new material slot. And I think for this, we'll use a couple of things. I think Rock's Dark will work well for his cloak color. Beautiful. And I think a slightly lighter one as well, perhaps for later on. So when it comes to drawing the knight's cloak, I found the best thing to do is to start with the outer frame. So we have here the bottom frame like this, and we'll use that to draw two shapes that indicate the outermost edges of the cloak, okay? And if we look at some key art, you can see that each strand ends in a point, and then there are some more strands that come out of the back and underneath sort of the rest of it. So what we need to do is find the point here, which is the most logical point that everything is stemming from. And we'll just start drawing some topmost layers that follow the general shape of our cloak curves that we drew earlier. So let's say we'll have 5 of those, and they can overlap. That's fine. We'll do each of those all the way across, and then we'll come back in, drawing behind with a slightly darker brush. So we have Rocks Dark. Let's try Rocks Darkest, and we'll draw an underlayer that kind of just fills in the gaps. And that looks pretty good to me without too much effort. Okay, so that was frame 1. Let's do another example frame. So you can kind of see what the plan is here. So we'll go back to the tool Rocks Dark. We'll insert a keyframe on this channel. And here I'm just looking to fill the gaps nicely, not worrying too much about the number of strands because it should be okay. Then essentially, that's going to loop. So, pretty boring to watch, so I'll do the rest in fast forward because we have a lot of frames. One quick thing to note is that if you're having trouble closing your stroke lines, you can always turn on trim stroke ends like so. This allows you to leave auto merge off, which is useful if you wanted to, for example, create a hard angle at the start of your stroke, draw everything that you need to draw, and then come through and cut that stroke. It will trim both of those ends off for you, which gives you a nice sharp edge without having to worry about closing your line work. Okay, and there we have the cloak animation done. A little bit rough, but that's okay, not too bad. So let's turn back on all the other details and see what it is that we're working with. Hey, that looks pretty nice. I'm pretty happy with that. Awesome. So pop back out into layout view and turn on everything else that we want to see. And we can start to see that our little animation is coming together. Now, the rest of the animation I'm going to do in this is basically repeats of that same technique, where there's a combination of the tweening, the frame by frame, stuff like that. But there are a few other little things that might be useful. For example, we applied noise to the knight's body. It might be useful to go into our other grease pencil objects and apply some modifiers here. Let's apply noise, for example, of 0.04 maybe, to some of the closer plants, and we can change the influence down here to the plant's leaves and also make another one for the plant's stems, and then perhaps a slightly weaker one, 0.02, for the moss. And that just adds, when we look through the camera, just a little bit of nice motion to those elements without too much extra work from us. So I'll do that to a few of the other moss things as well. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to animate Hornet, obviously, and I might add a little bit of motion to these plants as well, just to add a bit of life to the scene. Once we've done that, the last thing will be doing the lighting and setting up the camera motion. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so there you can see I've added some basic animation to the character's cloak, as well as the knight's head turning back and forth, and I've just used some simple noise modifiers as explained before to add some life and motion to the moss here. Usually I'd go into a lot more detail in this scene, clean everything up, but this will do for the sake of the tutorial. The next step then is to add some lighting to this scene and to set up the camera motion. Now, if you'll remember, I couldn't decide whether I wanted lights in the scene. I've decided in the end that I do. So what we need to do is just go to our grease pencil objects. Let's just take the knight here as an example. And under the layer properties panel, we just need to enable use lights for all of our layers. So I'm just going to go through and do that quickly now. Okay, so with all of those layers with lights enabled, we can go to render preview mode by clicking this icon up here or by pressing Z and going to rendered. And I'll just come out of my camera view so we can see the full setup of our scene here. Now, pretty simple stuff. I want to create individual lighting for each one of these layers so that I can choose what the final result looks like. So in order to help with that, I'm just going to drag out a second viewport once again, same as before, and look through the camera in this viewport here. In this one, we're going to use it to set up all of our lights. So let's Shift A new light, point light, and let's press G and Y to move it back in space until it's just in front of our characters here. I'm then going to increase the wattage to about 500. We're just going to create a very nice bright glow. So with that selected, I'm just going to push this a little bit into the cave, and I want the lighting in my scene to be blue. So I'm going to take the color of my light under my light settings down here, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of a blue tint. And that's going to blue up everything here. On this preview, we'll make sure we're looking in rendered mode. That looks pretty nice. Let's duplicate that light, right click and press Y to G and Y to move it back all the way against the moon. And we're going to use this light to just make it look like our moon is glowing. That's going to have like a 2000 watt brightness to it. We're going to increase the radius till it's nice and large. And we're going to make that blue stronger so that it reflects off of our mountains a little bit nicely here as well. This light here, I'm going to increase the radius so that it softens up just a little bit. And let's push by duplicating this light again and moving it on Y space. Let's pop this in front of our plants and I'll decrease the radius down and the wattage down to say maybe only 100. And I'm going to use this light to just position it in front of my plants. I want a nice bright glow on this plant here. And let's duplicate it again, move it along the X to glow up this plant. Then I'll grab both of those, Shift D along the Y, just to brighten up these lights here too, but I'm going to make these ones more blue because they are further into the shadows of the cave and I want all my shadows to have like a nice blue tint to them. I'm also going to decrease these down to like 50 or so they're only just lighting the edges of those plants. I'm going to take this single light, duplicate that back in Y space to light up here because I want it to be central to the two pieces of my landmass here. This needs loads of blue and we'll decrease that wattage down to 100 so that it doesn't affect the other elements in our scene quite so much. I'm just going to bring that forward until I'm happy. That looks quite nice. And last but not least, we're going to stick a little bit of light in front of this scene, but we're not going to put any at all in front of this one. What we are going to do with this though is just push it back in Y space and scale it up a bit because I feel like it's too close to the camera at this point. So let's just duplicate this final light, move it along in Y space until it starts to make the very edges of this final layer glow. That's looking really nice. So as you can see, a very simple lighting setup for this little animation here, just basically a bunch of point lights. What I might want to do, however, is fake a little bit of shadows with our characters here. So I'm going to grab Hornet and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate. And then I'm just going to rotate that along the X-axis until it's rotated 90 degrees. And I'm going to hold Control so that it snaps to that 90 degrees. Then we'll bring her down and out so that her feet are touching. Like so. So you can see in our camera view, we get a little bit of a shadow. Then we'll go to our effects and we'll go to add effects, colorize, and we'll say mode, custom, and the color will be black and the factor will be 1, and that will completely overlay her with black. Then we'll add another effect called blur. We'll give it a high sample rate, say 32, and we'll increase the size of that to say 200. And that's going to give us a really soft shadow underneath Hornet that we can position until it touches the feet. And the good thing is as well, that if we move our camera with this, it's going to move in 3D space with Hornet in perspective because it's an actual duplication of the same 3D object. So let's just do the same thing to the knight. Okay, that's looking pretty nice, but they're a bit strong at the moment. So I'm going to go back to these same layers and I'm going to add a transparency, colorize, which if we bring down to say a factor of about 0.3, you can see the difference in our camera frame here. So let's go to about 0.5 on those. So add effect, colorize, transparency, and 0.5. That looks much nicer. Okay, so lighting wise, I'm fairly happy with that. Final thing is just to add a little bit of motion to the camera, and this one is really easy. We're going to go back to frame 1. We're going to make sure that we have our camera selected, and we're just going to press G and Y to push that through Z space. And we're going to go right up to Hornet and the Knight. And we'll press I for insert keyframe and then location. Over on frame 250, we're just going to push the camera back through Y space, and all of our beautiful layering work that we've done is going to make itself apparent. I'm actually just going to go to my viewport display and turn down the passport 2 so I can see a little bit easier where the edge of my black is, like so. And we will keyframe the location there. And when we hit play, we'll start to see the effect of our work. Now, that looks pretty nice to me. There's a few things that I don't really like. I don't really like how you can see the bottom of these plants before the rocks cover them up slightly. So I'm just going to grab these plants and their associating lights. I'm going to find the point where I start to see what I don't like. And I'm just going to move them down a little bit so that we don't have to see that. That looks pretty nice. Additionally as well, you can see the edge of the sky here. So I'm just going to scale that up just a touch. That's looking nice. And then of course we will have to tweak the position of the moonlight as well to compensate for that. Okay. Another little tweak that I think I'm going to like to do is add a touch of rim light to both Hornet and the Knight. So I've actually just moved those lights that were next to Hornet ever so slightly. I've just popped one either side and slightly in front of them so that it doesn't quite blow out their dress so much. We're going to click Hornet and go to add effect, and we're going to choose rim light. And as you can see, that gives you this nice, rim light effect that we're just going to tweak so that it's not quite so powerful. And we'll just push it down like that. And instead of being yellow, it's obviously going to have a tint of blue to it instead. So that looks pretty nice. We're going to leave that as like a nice hard vector line, and we're going to do the same thing to the Knight. So add rim lights, change it to a blue, maybe one that's not quite so saturated for him, and we'll just push that so it's not quite so powerful, and that looks nice. Just a little rim light on the edge of his skull there. I'm also just going to add a little blur effect to the background as well. I don't want anything in the cave to be out of focus, but having something this far in the distance be in focus doesn't suit me very nicely, and it also hides the fact that I haven't done any details on the background. So I'm just going to blur that out a little bit as well. That way when they come into the cave like this, it's looking much nicer. And that is looking pretty good. I think I might just run through and tweak some of the colors, but then we will have a final result. Okie dokie, I think we are about ready to render. We can take a look at the final animation now. As you can see, looking pretty nice. There's a little bit of flickering on Hornet's face. I think that is due to the light being right on the verge of her grease pencil object, so we'll fix that by just bringing it forward a little bit. That looks much nicer. Okay, so here is our finished animation. Pretty happy with that. I might add some post-processing effects, but otherwise I'm fairly happy, and I think that is done. So it is now time to render. Let's just pause that and hit save. A few render settings. We're obviously in Render Engine Eevee. You may want to have a play with your color management settings, choosing between Filmic or perhaps Standard for a more poppy look to it. I'm going to leave it on Filmic for now. We're going to want to render this as a PNG sequence, so we'll make sure we have selected our folder under the output settings. And RGB is fine because there is no alpha channel, with a compression of 15 should be totally fine. That looks much nicer. Okie dokie, so we save and we go to render animation to render all of our individual frames. And because this is done in Eevee, it really should take no time at all. Okay, great. So we have now our render and all of our individual PNG frames rendered out into a single folder. I'm just going to pop these through After Effects for a quick bit of post-processing, but these are entirely optional steps. I'll just drag that whole folder into After Effects, right click and choose Interpret Footage, and I'm going to make sure that it's still on 24 frames per second. And we'll make a new composition from that selection. Let's go to full view mode and add a adjustment layer on top. Onto that adjustment layer, I'm going to add just a little bit of noise, maybe 7%, and make sure that it's a monochromatic noise. Then we'll add on top of that a small amount of turbulent displace. Let's make the size as low as possible, say about 2, and we'll pop the amount at around 30, and that just adds a little bit of texture to our line work really easily. Let's pop the complexity all the way up to 10 as well to get some real nice crunchiness to our lines. Check that at multiple stages throughout the animation. That looks pretty okay. As our characters zoom out though, it does get a bit crazy. So what I'm going to do is just keyframe that amount and size. And by the time it gets to the end of the animation, we'll just reduce that amount down to about 5. That looks pretty nice. On top of that then, I'm just going to add a curves adjustment. And I'm just going to push that bloom a little bit further on the moon there. And finally, let's add a little bit of a vignette. We will pin the highlights to keep that bloom, and let's crank the amount way up so we can really easily see what's going on, and then adjust the angle of view until it's a lot slighter, and then pop that back down to about 100. And that adds just a nice little vignette around the very edges of our screen there. And finally, let's add a hue saturation. And I just want to pump up the saturation a little bit, about an 8. That's nice. And let's just add an exposure as well. And we'll brighten that up by say 0.1. Let's go so far as 0.2 even. And that's it. Let's save and render this out as a video just using Media Encoder. We'll choose H.264 and match source high bitrate and just choose OK. Those settings should be fine for a quick test. And then click render. And that's it. You should now have your own awesome grease pencil animation. Congratulations. Make sure you share what you've made with me by tagging @TipTutZone on social. I'd love to see it. Thanks again for watching, everybody. You'll find plenty more Blender content on the channel. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time on TipTut. Massive thank yous to my level 2 and above members, without whom TipTut would have died a long time ago. I know I say it every week, but that's because every week it is true. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.